Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And tonight we'll be talking about that mysterious organization, the United Nations, and how people in Chicago can get associated with a smaller group here that actually would allow you to have some influence in what happens at the United Nations. Our guests tonight are Ms. Sana Hussien, who is the director of the Global Conflict Resolution Committee at UNA Chicago, and Professor Iymen Chehade, from Columbia College, Middle Eastern History, right?
That's correct.
So it's a mouthful, but here we go. So with that said, let's start a little bit with Sana. Let's start with you. UNA is the United Nations Association. What is it, and how is that different from the United Nations itself?
So it's an association for the United States. It's a United States association, and it's an organization that that allows Americans to participate in effectuating the UN goals.
And effectuating the goals, what does that really mean in terms of me, for example? How would I influence or effectuate a goal of the UN?
Well, first by advancing it. So I think a lot of Americans don't know what the United Nations actually does. They hear about it, and they usually hear about it in terms of politics or global conflicts. But I don't think that they know what the role is of the United Nations.
Isn't
what
it
it's
that shadow organization that's trying to take over the world? Isn't that really the UN?
Right, that one.
Yeah, that one. But actually, the UN, as you mentioned, it takes a leading role in conflict resolution, right?
Exactly.
So how does it do that as the UN? I mean, it doesn't really have an army as such. So how does the UN approach global conflict resolution?
Well, it's by being involved in different countries. For example, right now with the Syria conflict, there's actually a commission that's investigating the atrocities that are happening in Syria. And actually, one of the women on that commission is from right here in Chicago, Karen Abu Zaid. She's in New York right now. She lives here in Chicago, but she's in New York working on that commission, and she travels to Geneva all the time, and they actually record all the atrocities, have pictures, they investigate in order to expose what's happening and to galvanize the rest of the world.
So what happened? I mean, a commission can come in and study that, and clearly there are, in any war zone, there are atrocities, and certainly the history of the Middle East, at least the last several decades, is that there are no shortage of atrocities. So the commission study, what would that achieve at the end? How would things be different or better after having done the study?
Well, I think it all comes with exposure. I mean, I was in law school in the 1990s when the atrocities were happening in Bosnia. And I remember my professor at the time, my international law professor, Professor Bassioni, had commissioned a study and took students out to Bosnia, and they counted the bodies in the graves. And that brought attention, and ultimately it leads to resolution.
Because it shines a spotlight on it and gets world
Certainly.
attention? Okay. So, Professor Chehade, as a professor of Middle Eastern history, and particularly you focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, now as I understand, you're the head of a subcommittee within the Global Conflict Resolution Committee. So how do you go about trying to address, in particular, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which to many people seems unresolvable?
Sure. Well, I think one of the most important things to do with this particular issue is to present it for what it actually is, which is a human rights issue. The Palestinian people, since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, when we think of the conflict, we tend to think that it began in 1967. I think that's the way it's been framed in a lot of cases. But the reality is that the conflict actually began in 1947 with the UN partition plan that left hundreds of thousands of refugees, stateless, and
Palestinian refugees.
Palestinian refugees, stateless and homeless. And those refugees number 5.5 million people today, and they're scattered throughout the Middle East and the world. Right now, in addition to that, there's also the situation in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, where another 4.3 million people do not have citizenship or rights, both political and civil, that are derivative of the state that controls them, and that state is Israel. And then in addition to that, there are some 1.2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel. So there are three subgroups to the Palestinian people. And what we try to do is we try to figure out what would be the best cumulative possible solution for all three groups. And so we look into things like the human rights aspect of this issue, and that's what we primarily focus on.
Now, in human rights, former President Jimmy Carter wrote a book some years ago called "Apartheid in the Middle East," and particularly in regards to Palestinians, the treatment of Palestinians by the Israelis. And he was resoundingly criticized for that in the United States. In your classes or in your perspective, was he onto something? Is that a valid perspective on what's happening?
Well, he wrote the book Peace, Not Apartheid, and he was referring to the apartheid that he was specifically referring to was in the West Bank, which relates to and the Gaza Strip at that point. But the Israelis withdrew their settlers from the Gaza Strip. But what he's actually referring to is the fact that you have a minority population within the West Bank that has all the rights that a state gives, especially a democratic entity like Israel, which is a democracy for its Israeli Jewish population, by the way.
Well, there are Arabs who vote in
there are Arabs
Israel,
who vote, yes, but there is a level, there's a two-tier level as far as the differences in the rights allocated to the Arab population or the Palestinian citizen population of Israel and the Jewish Israeli population. So there's a difference between those two. But what he was referencing specifically was the settlers, the approximately today, they number about 600,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and the approximately 2.5 million Palestinians that live there. There are different sets of laws for the Palestinians as opposed to the settlers. And so it's a system where one minority has all those rights and the majority that lives there doesn't have any rights. So he compares it as to a lot of other individuals. Desmond Tutu, when he went to the West Bank, Desmond Tutu, of course, was a civil rights leader in South African apartheid. He said, look, the stuff that we see here is actually worse than some of the apartheid that we saw under South Africa.
Worse?
Worse, absolutely.
And in what respect? Did he go into detail? How did he see them being worse?
Well, first off, if you go to the West Bank, what you'll see is that there is the water resources that are allocated to the Palestinian population in comparison to the settler population. It's something like the number is astronomical in terms of the per capita water usage, for example, different license plates, different roads, different infrastructure, different electric grids. All these aspects separate the two populations from one another. The different laws for committing crimes are the Israeli settlers that are there are under the laws of the State of Israel, while the Palestinian population are under what are called military laws, where Israel basically has a blank check to do what they want to them. And so that's the human condition that obviously needs to change. And instead of the historical approach, which has been to say, well, if both sides have states, we get a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel, then the conflict's solved. But the reality is, do you really need a state to have people enjoy their rights? And the bottom line right now is whether Israel has annexed certain parts of the West Bank or whether it hasn't, or whether there's a so-called peace process or not. The bottom line is that Israel controls the entire territory. Mm-hmm. They control the 48 territory, they control the West Bank, they control the Gaza Strip, they control East Jerusalem. And the key is that if you are a state that's controlling another population, you should allocate and give those people rights. And so turning the issue into a human rights issue rather than a state-based issue, I think, is the key.
So now let's come back to the UN. Now, listening to Professor Chehade, the UN may have started this crisis in 1947 with the partition. So now the UN is trying to resolve it. Does the UN have the credibility to do that?
A lot of people probably would claim that they don't, since it was the UN partition that started this conflict. But considering that they knew what was in place at the time, and that the experiment or the result of what was done did not lead to a real resolution, and I think it's one of the oldest conflicts, 67 years, and I think there are only 2 conflicts that are that old, that are going on throughout the world. So I can understand people being skeptical about the UN wanting to be involved in the solution to this, but the UN is involved nonetheless. So they were involved at the beginning. They're involved right now because a lot of their humanitarian aid is in Gaza. A lot of people can't survive in Gaza without the UN aid. So the UN is
involved with it,
is involved with it, whether they like it or not. And if they resolve it, then they can get out of. then they can get out, and they won't have to keep fundraising and providing resources to refugees if those refugees were freed. So there is an incentive.
When you talk about refugees, are you talking about refugees within Gaza or the West Bank?
Yes, because they're not living like normal citizens. They're in camps. I mean, people in camps are, in my opinion, refugees. They're not able to sustain themselves. They can't eat. They can't go to school without that assistance. So the same assistance that's being given to Syrian refugees or Iraqi refugees in Jordan and Lebanon
is also being
has
given.
been done for 67 years in the Palestinian territories, but especially in Gaza, and with the wars in the past and the incursions in the past 4 years, Gaza is pretty much decimated. I don't know how anyone survives without the UN aid. So there's a huge incentive, in my opinion, for the UN to be involved in the solution.
So coming back to the UNA, the United Nations Association here in Chicago, what topics are you talking about? And the human rights issue, certainly, that we've just discussed, but how does the recognition of it being a human rights issue, how does the subcommittee that you're working on, or the committee, how do we take that perspective and turn it into action or even recommendations?
So the UNA USA Greater Chicago chapter has been active here in Chicago for several years, and it was revamped in 2012. And so we've gotten a lot more members. I think we have over 400 members in our chapter, which shows that these people are serious about their interest in what the UN's goals are and how they can advance those goals, how they can learn about them. And the Global Conflict Resolution Committee was just created in 2014. So we've only been doing research on conflicts for a year and 3 months so far. And notwithstanding that, we've been the fastest growing, because it appears that people are really interested in what's going on in the world.
It's good to hear, by the way. You frequently feel that it's the opposite.
Right, and they're volunteering to do research. They're volunteering to do additional work, whether they're students or people in the workforce. And so they're doing research, they're writing papers on the topics. And we certainly don't have the capacity to research all the conflicts that are going on in the world. So we started with 9. And the 9 conflicts are Syria, of course, Iraq, ISIS, Burma, Israel, Palestine.
Burma, also known as Myanmar, by the way, right?
Yes.
Yes.
And then we also have Nigeria, and then we have religious persecution. So there's subcommittees there, such as persecution of Coptics in Egypt, persecution of Christians all over the world. And I didn't know until this committee that, although the Christians are the largest population worldwide, that they're also the most persecuted, which doesn't seem logical, because usually it's...
You just have to listen to the current presidential campaign. You would have heard a lot of people talking about that.
Right. So those are the conflicts that we're researching and attacking. But we added one more conflict that we feel needs attention, and that's a conflict right here in the U.S., race and injustice in America. So
There's just been some local political contests decided on
Exactly.
some of those issues.
Exactly, and in fact, a lot of the solutions that that we were proposing, some of them have already been implemented by some of the suburban police, police institutions, which is great to hear that that they've recognized what's happening outside of the state as well as within our city, and that they took action. They didn't wait until something happened in their community to implement policies and procedures. And so, we take an in-depth look at, what is the breakdown, with respect to this issue.
So how did you recruit your teammate here to be to take on the toughest, seemingly most unresolvable issue that you're looking at of your 9 conflicts?
I actually sought out people who I thought were experts or knowledgeable in certain fields in race and justice, as well as the other conflicts. And with respect to Israel-Palestine, I thought I knew that he taught Middle East history as well as the Israel-Palestine conflict at Columbia, and I also knew just from reading in the paper that there's collateral damage right here in Chicago as a result of that, as a result of teaching the course, and even though he's right here in Chicago, that there's collateral damage of the conflict right here. And so I thought it would be interesting to bring in someone who doesn't only teach about the conflict but has experienced the result of it.
Come back to you, Professor Chehade. What is the kind of conflict that you're experiencing? How do you see these kinds of the blowback to you?
Well, you mentioned a little while ago about Jimmy Carter receiving blowback for the book he wrote years ago, where he basically criticized Israel's policies towards the Palestinians. And I think that it's very important to note that Israel today as an entity, if you go out there and kind of criticize Israel in some sort of way, especially when it pertains to the way that it treats the Palestinians and the way that it occupies them and the way that it denies them civil rights, whether you're a president, former president, whether you're a professor or anyone for that matter, people are going to come down hard on you. Now, in my case, I teach a class called the Israel-Palestine conflict at Columbia College. I've had my class canceled a few times already. In fact, it just got canceled again, by the way, a couple of days ago.
By whom? By the administration?
By the administration, yes. The first time it was canceled was 2 years ago as a result of showing a film called 5 Broken Cameras, which is an Academy Award-nominated documentary by a Palestinian in the village of Belain. They go every Friday. They go and after prayer they go and they protest nonviolently against this wall that has been built.
The so-called fence.
The so-called fence.
That's what, 25 feet high?
Yeah, in some places, yes, depending where. It's hundreds of kilometers long, but the idea, according to Israel, is to protect it from Palestinians. The International Court of Justice in 2004 ruled that it was illegal under international law because it actually veers into the West Bank, encroaching on land, taking a lot of land, and so forth. So I showed that film, and it's very, the documentary actually, it's not a film, and it's very visual. So you see what happens every week with the Palestinians and their supporters, many of whom are Israeli, by the way, protesting this wall and demanding that it be shut down.
So what reason were you given for canceling the class?
A student felt uncomfortable because I showed the documentary.
Heaven forbid.
Yes, because that's my job, is to make you feel comfortable. It's not to teach you. This is academia today, by the way. Yeah. She went to administration. She complained. A week later, a class that had been on registration was eliminated for the following semester. So we did a campaign. We got thousands of signatures. We got people from all over the country, all over the world to support us. And after a few months, the college decided to give the class back. They've actually canceled it twice since then. Last semester they canceled it. They brought it back after pressure. We just found out that one of the sections has been removed again for the fall semester of this year. So this is something that's been ongoing and
back and forth.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So.
Kind of like Palestine and Israel.
I was thinking it's very similar to the conflict, right? the question that makes me ask is, and I don't know how to do this without sounding biased myself, but is there an underdog here in this fight? It sounds to me, and from what I've read over the years of the conflict, that the Palestinian side of the story is not sufficiently told, and that the Israeli side of the story is primarily what we hear in the U.S. And I understand that the Israeli lobby is much stronger here than the Palestinian lobby is, and as we all know in politics, the lobbyists have tremendous sway. But do you feel that that's true, that there is one side that's being given preference over the other? And it's not either one of you can. It's not. What do you think?
I think that that certainly growing up here in Chicago, a lot of my friends who weren't Middle Eastern didn't really know about the conflict, or if they did, it was just blurbs. They didn't know what was the basis of the conflict. The internet, I think, has changed that tremendously. I feel that that people now have more resources, if they are interested in the topic, and which is why we have so many people, not just in the Israel-Palestine conflict, but in the other conflicts, that that although they have information, that they're able to get information, when they're actually involved, though, they're more likely to actually do the research and to become knowledgeable. So that's why we're proud of the GCR committee, is that they're volunteers, and all this information is available to everyone. They're committed to coming to the monthly meetings and to writing reports on the conflict, those that lead the committees. And so they're learning the process, and they're choosing topics not because they're related to it, but because they didn't know that conflict existed. They didn't know what the basis was, and then they start researching it, and then they're vested because they think it's so wrong and so unjust. So with respect to the Israel-Palestine conflict, absolutely, I think that that for all these years, the reason that the lobby was so strong is because of
they control the information.
Exactly. Where now the information can't be controlled, but then the opposite side is that with the internet comes tons and tons of information coming at you,
which may or may not be true. I mean,
exactly.
We all know.
Exactly.
Gee, I read it on the internet. That doesn't mean anything.
Right. So dialogue. What our GCR committee does, it allows for that dialogue, and for the past year we've been researching. We certainly don't have all the proposals yet, but our first panel discussion will be April 13th. It'll be on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and we'll have experts on both sides. And then on May 5th.
And can anyone attend that on April 13th?
Yes, it's on the website, and
Where will
it'll
it
be posted.
Where will it
This
be?
one will be held at the Polsinelli Law Firm. We're very fortunate that
Say that again slowly.
Polsinelli.
Paul Sinelli?
Yes.
Law firm. Okay.
Polsinelli Law Firm, yes. They're on the website as well. They've actually donated their offices for our monthly board meetings, and 3 of the board meetings are for the general membership, and we have programs, and so those programs have also taken place at Polsinelli. So it's local, it's downtown Chicago, easily accessible. And the panelists, I think, will all be interesting. And then we'll do another panel on another conflict in May for race and injustice, and that one will be on May 5th.
You might need a bigger venue for race and injustice.
That one will be at the John Marshall Law School.
Okay.
Yes.
So coming back to you, Professor Chehade, we're talking a lot about Chicago and bringing Chicagoans in. Other than the obvious advantage of having more brains looking at this, which is always a helpful thing, what is it that we think, or that you guys think, having this UNA here in Chicago, is there any kind of special aspects that we as a city can bring to these conflicts, something that we can contribute that might be uniquely Chicagoan?
Well, I think that all issues relating to social justice are social justice issues, whether it's the Palestine-Israel conflict or whether it's race issues here in America. There's a striking similarity between, the human experience, and that it's ultimately all the same. You can label it, call it different things, but here in Chicago, we've obviously had some problems as far as race relations and things like that. We know what's been happening with the situation as far as some of the killings here in Chicago with minorities and so forth. So linking those together, I think, is very important. One of the most wonderful things that's actually happened was linking the Black Lives Matter movement with the Palestinian experience. They're strikingly similar in terms of some of the things that happen to average Palestinian in the streets of Ramallah and an African American in the south side of Chicago, the way that they're treated and so forth. And so we can bring that.
Even though here the laws, at least as they're structured, apply equally to regardless of race or national origin.
I mean,
but we all know that
it depends on how you
implement them, how you defend them.
Absolutely. Technically,
right.
Absolutely right. Technically, on paper, yes. Mm-hmm. Is that the reality, though? Is an African American male treated the same as other?
I think many would answer you, and many African Americans would say, no, it's not the same reality that we live.
Right. So, on paper as opposed to the actual implementation of the law are two separate things. But those experiences, I think, can be combined and they can be utilized. And the more hands that are together, I think that the more powerful movements become. Right now, I have a project that I'm working on, which is called Uprising Theater. The plan is to open, hopefully, in the next few months. But it's actually the first theater in the country, possibly in the Western Hemisphere, I don't know, that prioritizes Palestinian plays, Palestinian art, Palestinian work. But it's also a social justice theater as well. And so linking other social justice issues with the Palestine question will go a long way in mainstreaming the Palestinian narrative. And I think this is a vital component to actually solving this issue, is to expose it to as many people as possible. This has been one of the problems with the Palestinian aspect and the narrative, is that there has not been any platform historically in the United States, although that's changing now with first and second generation Palestinians and their supporters and social media and things like that.
I would wonder as well if, most people think in terms of themselves. And so how does that conflict, half a global way, affect me? But what you're talking about is linking it to very local issues.
Absolutely.
And having people understand that, no, what's happening there is very much what happens to me. And so if we can solve it here, for me and my issues, maybe that transcends and can help to solve the issues overseas. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
Absolutely, yes. And just the familiarity of it. And so, for example, at Columbia College, we've had events over there that link the African American experience and the Black experience with the Palestinian experience, because people immediately see the connection when they take the class or when they come to the lecture and so forth. They immediately see the connection and they link up with each other. And as I've said, when you link up different movements with each other, they become more powerful. And so instead of the Palestine question just being a question just about the Palestinians, it's a human rights question. It affects not only Palestinians, but it affects anyone who has a social justice mindset. And what I've discovered is, over the years in teaching this, is that when people know what's happening over there to the Palestinians with regards to the Israeli injustices, and some people try to sort of dance around a statement like that and not say it directly, but this is the reality. There is an injustice going on over there. The reaction is strong. And so mainstreaming the narrative, letting it seep into the general population, I think will go a long way in the long run. And it's not something that necessarily is tangible.
We're out of time.
Okay.
So we have to wrap up with that. So Professor Chehade, Sana Hussien, thank you so much for being here, and I hope you get a good turnout on April 13th for your event.
Thank you.
So thank you for being my guest.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, and find us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So till next time, thank you and good night.